All right. So um, this whole attempted funding freeze from the Trump administration we're going to take a deep dive into what exactly is going on here, what this could actually mean, like the reasons behind it and what we might expect next. We've got like a whole bunch of viewpoints for you from sources like NDTV, CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC, and The Independent.
Yeah, it is interesting, because at first it did kind of seem like it just came out of nowhere. But then when you look at how the administration's been talking about things recently, it's clear this wasn't such a sudden move after all.
Yeah, okay, so let's break it down then, like chronologically, what actually happened.
Well, the freeze was ordered by Trump's acting head of the Office of Management and Budget, Matthew Vaeth.
Okay.
And this was supposed to halt all federal financial aid, which is trillions of dollars.
Trillions, wow.
Yeah. Think everything from healthcare and education to social services.
So, like, what kind of impact are we talking here? Sources mentioned healthcare and education, but can we get more specific?
Absolutely. So some sources highlight the potential impact on cancer research, like literally halting ongoing clinical trials,
All right.
And it's not only that, like programs that help patients access treatment and support services, those could be affected too.
That's heavy. And I think that's just one area, right? So this order was supposed to go into effect on January 28th, but a federal judge stepped in.
That's right. Just hours before federal judge Lauren L. Alicant issued a temporary restraining order. So basically, like, putting the freeze on hold.
Okay, so how did that happen? Why did the judge put a stop to it?
Well, a group of nonprofits actually filed a lawsuit. They were saying that the freeze would cause irreparable harm to people who are depending on these federal grants. And the judge agreed, for now at least. So it gives us some breathing room, but it doesn't solve the problem,
Yeah. This temporary restraining order is like, oh, pause then. What happens next?
Well, there are hearings scheduled for February 3rd, so the judge will decide then whether to extend the restraining order or let the freeze go into effect. It's probably going to be a pretty long legal battle, though.
Okay, so long process ahead. Let's step back for a sec and talk about why the Trump administration even decided to do this. What's their reasoning?
Well, the OMB memo, it talks about reassessing government initiatives, making sure they're in line with Trump's priorities.
Okay.
But if we look deeper into these sources, we see some specific concerns mentioned, things like what the memo calls Marxist equity and transgenderism. So, those are the concerns driving this whole thing.
So is this really about saving money like they claim, or is there something more?
That's the real question, right? It forces us to think about what the government is choosing to fund and why. It really comes down to power, priorities, and who benefits from all this spending.
So what's been the reaction so far?
Yeah, well, it's been pretty divided, to say the least.
I bet.
Yeah, so the White House is defending the freeze, saying it's necessary to ensure their spending priorities are being met. But then you have people like Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and some Democratic attorneys general who are calling the freeze unconstitutional and potentially really damaging.
So very strong opinions on both sides. What are the arguments against this freeze specifically?
Well, the main argument is that the president can't just unilaterally block funding that's already been approved by Congress, right? It brings up the whole idea of the separation of powers.
Separation of powers, right? So like they're saying he's overstepping his bounds.
Exactly, yeah. And that leads to some pretty interesting questions, not just about whether this is a good or bad idea in itself, but whether the president even has the legal authority to do this without Congress,
So this is essentially a constitutional showdown. What's really standing out to you in all these reactions?
What I find really striking is how this whole thing has become a flashpoint for some of the deeper anxieties in society. It's not just about the money. It's about the role of government, the balance of power, even like fundamental values all playing out right now.
It sounds like this one event is like a microcosm of the division we're seeing everywhere. Fascinating, but kind of overwhelming.
It is, yeah. And it's only the beginning. We're seeing a really crucial moment in American politics unfold, and it's impossible to say what'll happen next.
Okay, so we've been talking about the big picture stuff, the legal battles, the politics, but what about the everyday effects? What would this mean for like regular people?
Yeah, that's so important. We got to remember the human element in all of this. So let's look at some specifics from these sources, like really see what's at stake.
Okay, I'm ready. What are some of the most concerning impacts you saw?
Well, we already touched on cancer research, but it's worth repeating. If this freeze actually happens, think about it. It could stop clinical trials that are showing real promise, for new treatments.
Yeah, and it goes beyond just like future cures. This could impact people who need help right now?
Exactly. Programs that help cancer patients, get access to treatment and support services, those could all be cut. And that's just one thing.
Wow. It makes you think about all the areas that rely on this federal funding. What else could be affected?
Education is another one, a big one, like early childhood education, after-school programs, even grants that help low-income students go to college.
Yeah, and one article even mentioned food assistance programs like SNAP and WIC. Those programs help millions of families, put food on the table.
And this is where that whole irreparable harm idea really hits home. For so many people, these programs aren't like budget items. They're the difference between having food or going hungry, having health care or not. It's a lifeline.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that this isn't just about numbers. It's about people's lives.
And it's not just individuals, whole communities, too, like rural hospitals that depend on federal funding to stay open, or nonprofits that provide really crucial services.
So what happens to those organizations if that funding's gone?
It could be a ripple effect, through the whole community, all sorts of negative consequences. And another important point is that the impact wouldn't be equal everywhere.
What do you mean by that?
Well, marginalized communities, people who already face a lot of systemic barriers, they're going to be hit the hardest by cuts like this. And that brings us back to our earlier conversation about power and priorities,
Right. Who benefits? Who loses out? These are all really important questions we need to think about.
Absolutely. And as we follow this whole situation, we have to stay informed, pay attention to the real human stories, behind all the headlines. It's so easy to get lost in the abstract debates about budgets and policies. We can't forget about the real impact on people.
Okay, so we've talked about the what and the why, but how did we even get to this point? Was there something that led up to this?
That's a great question. I mean, this didn't just appear out of nowhere. There's a whole political landscape that's important to understand.
Right. When you look at some of the sources, you see this isn't just some isolated event. It's the latest chapter in this whole battle over the role of government and spending.
Exactly. Yeah. For decades, there's been this back and forth about the size and scope of government. What programs should be funded and how much.
And these debates, they often fall along party lines, right?
Yeah. You're right. Democrats tend to favor a more active role for government in providing social services, while Republicans often want smaller government, lower taxes.
So is that all it is? Just typical partisan politics?
Well, it's a factor, but it's more nuanced than that.
Right.
You also see these ideological battles happening within each party, too.
Oh, really? Can you give us an example?
Sure. Within the Republican Party, there's this tension between traditional conservative values like fiscal responsibility and a focus on social issues. You see both of those at play here.
So both of these perspectives are driving this freeze.
Yeah. Exactly. The administration says it's about, being responsible with spending, but at the same time, they're targeting programs that, they disagree with ideologically.
So it's not just a simple budget thing. It's a clash of values.
Yeah.
Right? Like a fight over what kind of country we want to be.
That's a great way to put it. It's a battle that's been going on forever, each side winning and losing along the way. But there's something about this moment that feels different.
What do you mean? How is this different?
It feels like the stakes are higher now, like a sense of urgency, like something fundamental is changing in our politics. And that's reflected in the intensity of the reaction to this.
Yeah, there are people who are really alarmed by this, who see it as a threat to democratic norms, and the whole social safety net.
Yeah, and then you have people who are actually praising it. They see it as a way to, reassert traditional values, pull back on what they see as government overreach.
And it seems like those two sides are further apart than ever, with not a lot of common ground.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. But even with all this, there's also opportunity.
Opportunity? Really? How so?
Well, think about it. This forces us to really confront some basic questions about who we are, as a society, what we value. It makes us think critically about the role of government and the compromises involved in all these policy choices.
So you're saying this whole funding freeze is like a catalyst for a bigger conversation about the future of the country?
Exactly. And that conversation, however messy and uncomfortable it gets, it's crucial if we want to build a more just and equitable society.
Hey, that's a really great way to look at it. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the main takeaway you want our listeners to think about?
I think the most important thing is understanding that this isn't just about money. It's about values, about priorities, and ultimately about the kind of future we want to build.
It's a reminder that politics isn't just some game played in Washington. It has real consequences for real people, and that we all play a part in shaping how this all goes.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into this federal funding freeze. We've covered a lot of ground, the legal challenges, potential impact, all the political and ideological stuff. But now let's look ahead. What might actually happen from here?
Yeah, the million-dollar question, right? It's really tough to say for sure. So many factors could change things.
So let's break it down then. What's the next step? What's coming up first?
Well, we've got those hearings on February 3rd, right?
Right.
That's where the judge will decide whether to extend that temporary restraining order or not. So that's the first big thing.
Okay, so walk us through the possibilities. What could happen at the hearing?
Well, the judge could extend the restraining order. Okay.
Which would keep the freeze on hold, give more time for all the legal stuff to play out.
And what if they don't extend it?
Then the freeze would go into effect, which would be a big win for the Trump administration, but I'm sure the legal battles would keep going.
Okay, so let's say that happens. Restraining order's gone. The freeze goes into effect. Then what? What would that actually look like?
I think it'd be pretty chaotic, like government agencies scrambling to figure out how to actually implement this thing, which programs get cut, how to deal with the disruptions, the lawsuits, a logistical nightmare.
And like we said, there's the real impact on people, right? People depending on these programs could be in a tough spot.
Absolutely. But beyond that immediate stuff, there's the long-term question of what this all means for for the relations between the executive branch and Congress.
Yeah, we talked about separation of powers. This whole thing really raises some questions about whether a president can just do this on their own, freeze funding that Congress already approved. Exactly. That's the core legal argument, and something the courts will have to figure out. If they side with the Trump administration, it would set a precedent, a big one.
So essentially it would give the president a lot more power over spending.
Exactly. And that could change how things work in Washington.
So we've talked about the legal stuff, the politics, but zooming out even more, what does this tell us about American democracy right now?
That is a big question. I think it really highlights the polarization, the dysfunction that's going on.
In what way?
Well, think about it. This fundamental disagreement about the role of government, what should be funded, the values we should focus on as a society. And those disagreements, they seem to be getting worse.
And its disagreements are happening in this system that's already so gridlocked, so polarized. It seems like it's harder to find common ground these days.
Exactly. We've lost the ability to talk about this stuff, have productive conversations. It's all about winning now, scoring points, making the other side look bad.
That doesn't leave much room for compromise or progress. Sounds kind of bleak.
It is a challenge, yeah. I think this whole funding freeze is a symptom of something bigger. It's like our system is having trouble, dealing with all the challenges we're facing.
So where do we go from here? What's the path forward? Any reason to be optimistic?
I don't have all the answers, but I think step one is just recognizing the problem. We're in a dangerous spot. We've lost the ability to listen, find common ground, work together.
So how do we get that back? How do we start having those productive conversations again?
It won't be easy, but it has to start with, being willing to listen, understand different perspectives, try to find that common ground. We have to get past this win at all costs mentality. Remember, we're all in this together.
That's a powerful message. A reminder that even with all the chaos, all the uncertainty, there's still hope. We can find a better way.
Absolutely. We have to hold on to that. We can build a more just and equitable society. It's a fight worth having.
I couldn't agree more. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. This conversation isn't over, though, so stay informed, stay engaged, keep asking those tough questions.
Yeah, the future depends on it.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into something timely and important. Until then, stay curious.
And stay engaged.